Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 8. We're officially over the halfway point, so we're coming down the stretch here. Happy Super Tuesday, right? So today is Super Tuesday, which is when 13 states are going to have their primary elections and their primary caucuses. And a lot of people believe that the nominations may be sewn up tonight. So definitely tune in and see what the results are tonight, because it's going to give you a pretty solid idea of who the next presidential nominees are going to be, right? So who are the Republicans going to nominate? Which, if things go the way that they're looking now, it looks like it could be Trump, right? So we'll know much more tonight. If Rubio can't win more than one state, I think people are predicting that he may win in Minnesota. If he can only do that, then I think Trump's lead is going to be pretty insurmountable, and especially if Trump wins in Texas, Ted Cruz's home state, then Cruz is done. But right now, it looks like Cruz is actually ahead in Texas slightly. So we'll see. And then Hillary and Bernie. So after Hillary's crushing win in South Carolina, a lot of people are predicting that because of the African American vote, she won the African American vote practically 90% to 10%. And there are a lot of African American voters in the states that are voting today. People are predicting that she's going to pretty much sweep the South, which is going to give her a considerable lead. There are several states in play that Sanders can win, but a lot of them don't have the delegate count that the southern states have. So people are expecting Secretary Clinton to come out of Super Tuesday with a pretty good stranglehold on the primary nomination. I don't think it's over, but she's going to be really far ahead, would be my prediction. Okay, so a couple of announcements. The midterm is not this week, right? Not in week 8, but in week 9 is going to be the midterm. It's going to be next. I'm going to open it up next Thursday or Friday. I'll let you guys know next week, maybe a little bit early because it's right before spring break. It'll be a mix of, just like the quizzes, it'll be a mix of true, false, and multiple choice, but in the addition at the end, there will be some short essay questions. Another major difference is that the midterm is closed book versus open book. So something to keep in the back of your mind, and it'll cover all the material that we've covered up until that point. Quiz 2, question 2, right? So we had a little bit of confusion last week on that question, and the question was essentially, at the very least, what percentage of the vote does a nominee need to secure at the nominating convention to actually become the party's nominee, right? So at one point in the document, the guide to presidential elections, it said that the candidate must secure at least 50%, right? And at another point, it said that the candidate must secure a majority, which is right? You have to secure a majority. However, you have to remember that when the statement says that a candidate must secure at the least 50%, that does not preclude them getting more than 50%, right? So in the case of these two conventions, really what the candidates have to secure is 50% plus one vote, right? And let's see, I wrote the numbers down. So there are 4,763 delegates available in the Democratic Convention. In order to achieve the nomination, the candidate needs to have 2,382, right, which is essentially 50% plus one in that particular case, which equates to 50.0004. For the Republican nomination, there are 2,472 available delegates, and the successful nominee has to achieve 1,237, which once again is 50% plus 1. It's 50.007, I believe. So that's the threshold that they need to cross to get there, right? So the answers were between 50 and 51, right? That was the confusion. So doing a little math, 51% of the delegates for the Democratic side would be 2,429 versus what's actually required is 2,382. And same for the Republican. They don't meet that 51% threshold. So the answer is not 50%, but at least 50% is the right answer because it's 50% plus 1, and it doesn't come to 51%. I know that's confusing, right? It's confusing, but those are the numbers that the delegates have to achieve to win the nomination. So it's not 51%, it's 50% plus 1 vote. So, but I know that the language in that document was a bit confusing. So if you said 50 or 51%, I'm giving you credit for that. Okay, so this week we were talking about the invisible primary, right, and the party establishment. So I thought we could do maybe like the 5 W's and an H, right, about this notion of the party establishment, right? So who is the party establishment, right? The party establishment are the major players in the major parties, right? So the Republican and Democratic parties. And what we're talking about when we're talking about major players is we're talking about congressmen or women, right? So senators and representatives from the state. We could be talking about state representatives or state senators within the Republican Party. We could, or Democratic Party. We could be talking about governors, right? A Republican or Democratic governor. We're also talking about people who are on the Republican and Democratic national committees, so committee members as well, and major fundraisers perhaps also fit into this category. So they are the major players within the party, right? And something that's important to keep in mind is this whole nomination process. That's not something that's regulated necessarily by the federal government. There are no laws in the Constitution that regulate how this happens. All this stuff is regulated by the parties themselves. The parties are the ones who are deciding who's going to represent. The party decides, right? The parties are going to be the ones who decide who their nominee is. But of course, the parties don't want to get too far away from their base, which is why we have this very convoluted and complex system of a popular indirect vote for selecting delegates, right? So delegates to the national conventions are selected by the popular vote for the most part, right? But anyway, I'm getting off course. So the party establishment are the major players within the party, right? And the parties themselves are the ones who decide who's going to represent them the best. So you have it's sort of two people, right? And within the party, you have the voters and you have the party elite, right? So which one of these two constituents of the party actually decides who's going to represent them? So what is the invisible primary, right? So we've been talking a bit about the visible primary, right? That's the stuff we've been following on CNN and Fox News and all these other media outlets, and that's what's happening today on Super Tuesday. These are the actual primaries and caucuses that happen during the primary season. That's the visible primary. We can see, Donald Trump receives 40% of the vote in South Carolina or whatever, right? That's the visible primary. The invisible primary, so the visible primary, it has to do with the voters within the party. The invisible primary has to do with getting the support of the elite, right? So that's what we're talking about, getting the endorsements, getting these people behind you, and we'll talk about why that's important when we get to the why section, which is where we're going now, right? So why? Why is it important to win this invisible primary? Well, there were these authors who came up with this article this book that was reviewed in this particular article called The Party Decides, right? And their idea was, well, even if, the popular vote says a certain thing, it's really the people that the elite are the ones who are going to determine who's going to be the nominee, right? And then they said that there are several tools. This is the how, right? How they actually can influence the elections. So some of the things they said are they can affect the primary calendar, right? So um, we know that places like Iowa, right, and New Hampshire and South Carolina and Nevada play a really important part in the political process, in the nomination process. All these calendar dates are actually set by the parties themselves. There's nothing set in stone outside of the parties that say that Iowa will hold their caucus first. It hasn't always been the case, right? And as a matter of fact, the parties recently have came out and said that there are only 4 states that can have their primary elections or caucuses before March 1st, and that is those 4 states, right? And then the parties decide, well, you can actually hold your election on this particular day. You can hold your election on this particular day. Why is that important? Think about the way that the Democratic primary is set up, right? It's rolling into. It started off with Iowa, New Hampshire, right, which were sort of amenable or at least on equal footing for Sanders and Clinton. But look at Super Tuesday, right? There's this great percentage of African American voters, and it's pretty well known that the African American voters largely support the Clintons and Hillary Clinton. So she goes into Super Tuesday, and she sweeps through the southern states, and because the Democratic Party has set up the primary elections in such a way so that she comes in and cleans up essentially on Super Tuesday, and then that of course gives her the momentum to go ahead and move through the election, right? Something else that they can do is they can the party has a say on ballot qualifications. There are different types of primary elections. There are open primary elections, there are closed primary elections, and there are hybrid primary elections. The party decides what the election procedures or qualifications are going to be for those particular states, right? So Florida, for example, has a closed primary, which means that in order to participate in the Florida primary election, you have to be a registered Republican or Democrat. Debates, right? We've seen this has been really interesting in the current election. Look at the difference between the Democratic debates and the Republican debates. There have been many more Republican debates than there have been Democratic debates, and they've been happening during prime time for the most part. The Republican debates have been happening, during the week, and Thursday, Tuesday, when people are actually going to watch. Contrast that to the Democratic debates, which primarily have been happening on the weekends, right, on Saturdays and Sundays, when people may not necessarily be tuned into their TV. So you can see, if you can read between the lines on these things, you can see how where the party elite and the establishment is actually placing their bet, right, in that particular situation. Fundraising, obviously, the party elite, they have access to tremendous wealth and tremendous resources. They can throw that behind. They also have a large swath of volunteers with a lot of expertise in carrying out elections, because there's a lot that goes into doing this. So just recently, one of the greatest campaign strategists in Democratic history joined Hillary Clinton's campaign. Right, this was the guy who engineered President Obama's win in 2008, 2012. Swoops, I believe, John Swoops, I believe is his name, and he recently joined because of the elite endorsement of Hillary Clinton. And the last thing, which is really important, I know some people were pushing back against this idea, and perhaps this election does push back against this idea to a certain way, but it's this notion of endorsements. And there's been a lot of research done that says that people who are staunch Republicans or staunch Democrats place a lot of emphasis on the party leaders and what they actually say, right? So there have been studies done that have shown that if, let's say, let's see, who would be a good example? We can just use Rick Scott as an example, right? Let's say that the people in Florida were very, supportive of Rick Scott as a Republican, and he wielded a large influence. So if Rick Scott were to say something that were not in keeping with the actual, conservative principles that typically accompany the Republican Party, people would say, yeah, that's right. The Republican voters would have a tendency to actually support that policy, even though it's not in keeping with their principles, just because somebody influential actually said it within the party, right? So I don't know, maybe Rush Limbaugh or somebody like that, somebody really influential within the Republican Party. Rick Scott may not be a good example, but you get my point. Okay, so they say that the endorsements actually plays a big role, and you have to remember that the people that are voting in these primary elections are pretty partisan, right? They're typically very Republican or very Democratic. Okay, so there were some objections that, or some observations that the author of this article made. One, he said that, yeah, there's maybe some truth to this particular study that they found, but he said typically, there are three cases that happen, right, with the endorsement of the party elite. One is in the case that the choice is obvious, right? So if there's an obvious choice, the party elite throws in behind them pretty early, and they just steamroll the competition. Which, if the choice is obvious, then this whole thing about having all this extra influence is a bit redundant, right? The second thing is that if the choice is not obvious, many of the establishment players actually wait until, and this is what we're seeing sort of, at least on the Republican side, this is what we're seeing in this current election season, is that a lot of Republicans are still, a lot of the establishment are still withholding their endorsements. We're seeing some people pop up here and there, but by and large, a lot of the delegates have not thrown in with those particular candidates. That reminds me of something else that's really important, especially on the Democratic side, is that these establishment members are actually super delegates to these conventions, right? And that's why if you look at the current delegate count in the Democratic Party, you'll see that Hillary Clinton is way ahead because all these establishment members are super delegates at the convention, and they pretty much unanimously support Clinton. So this invisible primary is not only for all these resources that we talked about earlier, but it's also for getting these superdelegate votes. And there are less superdelegates in the Republican Party, but they're still there. So, and then the final thing that the author said, and they gave some examples, is it's possible that you get all these endorsements and you still lose, right? So there's no guarantee. And then they talk about how this particular election it almost flies completely in the face of this notion that the party decides, right? It seems very much right now that the people decide, because using the Republican Party as an example, so maybe it's the tale of two parties, right? So the Republican Party, it seems clear that the establishment does not support Trump. They don't support Ted Cruz, but yet in these primary elections and caucuses, Cruz and Trump are getting by far, 60 to 70% of the vote, right? So a major percent. Originally, the establishment was behind Bush. That we saw what happened with that, fell flat. And recently, they've been supporting Rubio. So I guess we'll see tonight, whether this prediction actually takes place. But it seems like, at least on the Republican side, that the people are going against the establishment. Right? On the Democratic side, that's not as clear. On the Democratic side, it seems like the party is wielding quite a bit of influence in sort of these surreptitious ways, right? So like setting the debate schedule to be on the weekends, right? And the way that the Super Tuesday states and the sort of the election, the primary election schedule is actually set up seems to favor Clinton by quite a bit, right? So even though Sanders has made an incredible push, it still may not be enough to overcome all the support that Sanders has from the establishment. Okay, so then they ask, well, why is this year different? Right? They said that there are a couple of reasons why this sort of party rules, party decides theory may not be right. One thing that the author said was that if there's a really divisive issue, like they pointed to Vietnam and they pointed to the war in Iraq as a divisive issue that can really pull people away from the influence that's wielded by the particular party. Well, the question becomes, what is the divisive issue this year, right? And that's a question that's very much up for debate. In my mind, I think it has to do with the economy, right? And I also think it has to do with a divided a very fragmented Republican Party. You have the traditional sort of Republican wing, you have the Tea Party, and then you have sort of people in the middle who are sort of issue focused, right? So, but I think it has something to do with this. I really think it's a generational thing at this point, right? Because you have a lot of people who were in the manufacturing economy, and NAFTA happened, globalization happened, and a lot of their jobs, manufacturing jobs, and as we know this story, manufacturing jobs are pretty much gone, right? So you have a lot of those people who were left hanging out to dry, right? And they're very angry with the economic situation, and I think if there is a divisive issue, I think that's what it is. I think when you boil it down to its most fundamental level, it's the economy and this sort of unequal distribution of wealth, right? And there are several other issues, but they all sort of piggyback on the economy. So I think that's the divisive issue that's at play here, and it's not a surprise that that was Sanders' primary message was the economy, the unequal distribution of wealth between the rich and the poor, right? And people not having access to any sorts of opportunities to get out of that, right? And it's also not surprising, perhaps, that Clinton, when she saw the success of Sanders' campaign, jumped onto that bandwagon as well, right? Because I think they all realized, the smart ones realized, that is the issue, right? That is the major issue. And then the second reason that the author suggested that this election might be different is the role of the media, right? And some people pointed this out in the discussion, which was good. It's much easier to educate yourselves now, right? So we're seeing this stuff being constantly bombarded with this stuff. 24-hour media outlets, social media, papers. If anybody reads the paper anymore, the stuff is constantly in there, right? So we don't have to rely as much on what the party elites tell us anymore, because we can educate ourselves on these particular issues. So anyway, that's the invisible primary, and that's the party establishment, and this election may be a very interesting case study of whether the party does decide, right? And I think really, as I said earlier, I think it's the tale of two parties, because in the Republican Party, it's yet to be seen whether the party will decide, which is very interesting. It's the question of the election, I would say. But we'll find out tonight, right? Probably. We'll be a lot closer to answering that question. If we don't find out tonight, we'll definitely find out 2 weeks from now, when Florida and Ohio have their primaries. At the Democratic Party, it looks very much like the party elites are deciding. I mean, even though there's been this push by Sanders, it looks like he's going to fall short. Anyway, that's it for this week. If you have any questions about anything,